Okay, so thank you for joining us for our concluding session titled Human-Animal Studies, Developments, Problematics, Trajectories. This panel will be facilitated by Kenneth Shapiro, who is co-founder and president of the board of Animals and Society Institute. Apart from supporting new human-animal studies initiatives, being a distinguished speaker, and leading the ASI, Kenneth is also the founding editor of Society in Animals Journal of Human-Animal Studies, the Brill Human-Animal Studies book series, and founding co-editor of Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science. He has published papers in human-animal studies on vegetarianism, animal advocates, animal-centered literary criticism, critics of lab animal-based research, interspecies qualitative methods, ontological vulnerability of captive animals, and the state of the field. His most recent article is entitled Human-Animal Studies, Remembering the Past, Celebrating the Present, and Troubling the Future. The full text is available in open access at the Animals and Society Institute website. Knowing Ken for almost 4 years now, I had the privilege to closely getting to know his generosity in sharing valuable information and experience and in helping and encouraging the growth of the field of human-animal studies all over the world. Dr. Ken Shapiro, it's my privilege.
Thank you, Anat. Thank you for that generous introduction. So I just want to begin with a very loud shout out to the conveners of this conference. It's a remarkably well designed, organized, disciplined, keeping on time, great variety of presentations, formats, really just a wonderful job. So thank you.
Thank you.
This session is entitled Human-Animal Studies, Development, Problematics, Trajectories, and is presented in a panel format featuring 4 scholars from different areas of the field. The panel will discuss the state and the future of human-animal studies with particular emphasis on current tensions within the field, institutional barriers within academia, and how these and large forces, such as global warming, the dramatic reduction in wildlife, and politically, the international resurgence of rightist governance might inform and trouble its future trajectories. I personally feel that the latter, the political issue, is a particular concern. I think of this xenophobic component of far-right politics, its intolerance of ethnic, racial, gender, and of course, species otherness. Since the focus of the panel is on problems and threats to the field, I want to provide some balance by starting with a few words that celebrate where the field is at currently. First, where it has come from in its relatively short life, but I also want to take the liberty of interspersing my remarks with some comments on this conference. I did also want to add that it is great to see so many early career scholars presenting and attending the conference. This speaks volumes to the future of the field. Some of the following remarks are especially addressed to you as you pursue careers in this field. So, a brief historical note. The field arguably had its beginnings in the seminal works of Singer, Reagan, and Midgley in the 70s and 80s, although others point to Richard Ryder's work and the Harrison volume on factory farming. This origin of the animal turn in moral philosophy then was followed in the 80s by scholarship largely in the quantitative social sciences. This provided a credible empirical base for the field. Next, in the 90s and aughts, studies in the qualitative social sciences and humanities greatly expanded the field and brought on board a multitude of interpretive methods adapted where necessary to include the study of non-human animals. This under the foundational heading, the animal question. Also in this period, the need to give fuller attention to the role of non-human animals in human-animal relationships was recognized, the so-called animal turn in the animal turn. Recently, political theory is expanding focus from the philosophy-based claim of moral considerability of animals, are they obligatory objects of our moral consideration, to questions about their political status. more than property? Are some cohabiting citizens, some merely denizens, and some separate nations? Finally, accompanying this development and with the relative acceptance of the field within academia, there has been a greater openness by scholars to address the policy and practice implications of the findings in the field. This move is further buttressed by the currency of the ideas of engaged scholarship and effective advocacy. I might comment here on the several papers in this conference that took positions on different political and economic systems and their likely treatment of animals. We heard arguments that build on the current dominant Western system of free market capitalism, while others call for truly radical change. So we have, on the one hand, attempts for more humane communities, similar to Wayne Pacelles' humane economy, that build on the status quo, most clearly represented in the field by anthrozoology. On the other side, some scholars believe that a true end to animal oppression requires the dismantlement of the regnant neoliberal form of capitalism and capitalism more generally, as represented by critical animal studies. While I generally believe in pursuing change on all fronts at once, I am concerned about a call for radical political and economic change that is unlikely to be effected except in some distance or even middle-term future. It is also not clear under what alternative system animals would do better. Certainly, historically and currently, more socialist and centralist economies and polities have not been associated with diminished animal oppression. This is a critical conversation to continue to engage in. For example, will raising the living conditions of the human population of the world provide a solution to the animal question? Or is the increase in per capita consumerism and lifestyle footprint incompatible with a thriving population of the millions of other species on this planet? Even if we successfully debunk human exceptionalism, is the sheer numbers of humans compatible with a biodiverse ecology? So a word about the current state of the field. At present, the field has proliferated with the establishment of interfaces with as many as 24 different disciplines. So in this context, a note about this conference. I was very pleased to see the inclusion of scholars who practice in the arts at this conference, both performing and fine arts, dance, film, painting, poetry. They are important contributors to scholarship by adding to the critique of human exceptionalism. And as importantly, through the dissemination of their artworks to the general public. Just think what the octopus teacher is doing for the recognition of octopuses, and hopefully what Gunda will do for pigs. Beyond art about animals, they elevate animal being by the inclusion both of the production of art and its aesthetic appreciation by some animals, both in nature and in mixed species studios. I recall Hartshorn's largely forgotten answer to the question of why birds sing, because they like to. It appeals to their aesthetic sensibility. Despite this explosive and still accelerating growth and various contending names for the field, there remains a clear consensus as to its definition, the study of human-animal relationships. This is a much-needed corrective to studies that, while including non-human animals as a variable, were truly human-centered, and on the other hand, to fields like ethology and comparative psychology that largely stayed at the domain of non-human animals. The consensus and the impressive growth of the field can also be understood as a response to the animal protection movement. As other social justice movements led to the development of complementary areas of study, so human-animal studies provides a much-needed empirical and theoretical basis to better bother our exploitative treatment of animals in the various settings which we have constructed for them: the factory farm, the lab, the circus, and increasingly managed wilderness, and even in the home, where animals are now all too frequently part of the cycle of domestic violence. In addition to this definition of the subject matter of the field, human-animal studies has a shared common approach. It is a critical stance, a hermeneutic, a way of reading any phenomenon. It frames how we explicate, understand, and evaluate any human-animal relationship in such a way that animals are moved from the margin of the page to the main text. This puts us in a position to unravel, disentangle, deconstruct their role in co-constituting a given human-animal relationship. A final and crucial feature of this approach is that it insists on and really rests on the value of valuing animals for themselves rather than primarily for us. An overview of the present state of the field provides much occasion for celebration. So many journals, book series, conferences, satellite interest groups in the interfacing disciplines, courses, majors, minors, programs, institutes, fellowships, webinars, podcasts. For early career scholars, with these structures and venues in place, you have the opportunity to get in what is still really the ground floor. More importantly, your involvement in the field gives you membership in a community of scholars who share in a common cause, one which intersects with other social justice movements and which allows you to meld your individual values and lifestyle with your career. Human animal studies is a calling, not just a job. It is an opportunity to enrich and deepen your life. It can have the downside of exposing you to risk of burnout and vicarious traumatization. These latter issues can be addressed through networking with like-minded scholars. The University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana and Animals and Society Institute host a summer institute that provides such a setting and invite early career scholars to consider applying for the program. It is really gratifying for me, on a personal note, to see that 3 of the organizers and 1 presenter at this conference are former Summer Institute fellows. Of course, there are rocks in this stream. And while I look forward to the panel addressing these challenges and obstacles more fully, I float some of them here. One challenge is in terms of method. It is more challenging to study a relationship, the between, than discrete entities. And here it is a relationship between individuals of different species. It is a challenge to develop methods that provide access to and verifiable descriptions of the experience of animals. More generally, how can we get access to the animals as such, the animal before our social constructions? We can deconstruct and we can infer from findings in ethology and comparative psychology. Beyond these, with the expansion of the field to the qualitative social sciences and the humanities, we see additional moves and methods, participant observation, various methods developing in multi-species ethnography, reimaginary enactment, storytelling, and various ways of facilitating empathy with the lived world of animals. One prominent boulder is the disciplinary-based structure of our academic institutions that leaves little navigability for an interdisciplinary enterprise, and in some quarters degrades the status of the field to a niche study or a fad. Another obstacle is the priority given in research grants to exclusively human-centered scholarship. Although just maybe the 4 secular horsemen of the apocalypse, the 6th great extinction, the massive reduction in wildlife numbers, now including insects, global warming, and the COVID epidemic may occasion, if belatedly, the spread of that largesse to nature and non-human animal research. A more hidden rock is the submerged but insidiously operative view in mainstream academia that animal-related scholarship, especially that devoted to the study of mixed species relationships, is a kind of dirty work, a lower status occupation that threatens to violate the received view of human exceptionalism. This is readily apparent in the plight of young scholars who often face lack of support and even opposition to their human-animal relationships-related dissertation topics. As a result of this resistance, young scholars often are reluctant to be upfront about their interest in the field as they apply for academic positions. Ironically, and this is a positive development, particularly the smaller universities and colleges are seeing the growing population of human-animal studies as a way of marketing their institution through a new program. So turning finally to the format of the panel, there'll be 2 separate rounds, in each of which the 4 panelists will address the topic for that round. Each panelist will speak for up to 7 minutes, leaving another 7 or 8 minutes for Q&A. I'll do my best to keep time, unless you're going to do that or not. Hopefully I don't need to resort to enabling the remote ejection device that I've installed in each of the panelists' computers. So Annette, if you could present the first question, I'll read it. Identify what you see as the major tensions within the field and evaluate their positive and negative influences on the trajectories of the field going forward. How should these shape the institutional form of their presence within the university? So our first panelist is Leslie Irvine. Leslie is Professor of Sociology and Director of the Animals and Society Certificate Program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is the author of several books, including My Dog Always Eats First, which examines homeless people's relationship with their companion animals, and Filling the Ark, which focuses on animal welfare in disasters. So again, Leslie, it's all yours. You have up to 7 minutes to respond.
Thank you, Ken. And I have my stopwatch enabled so that you don't have to resort to the ejection button there. I'm glad you gave that nice history. When I started graduate school in 1990, my advisor asked me what I wanted to study. And I said, I thought I wanted to study people's relationships with their cats. And she said, what other ideas do you have? And there was no way to do what I wanted to do. I agree with Ken that it felt like it was a calling. But by the end of the decade, got through graduate school, got a tenure track job, got my first book out. That was possible. And I think that's remarkable that within 10 years, you could go from, no one's heard of it to now there's a recognized subfield. So I am really pleased to be part of this area of study. In my view, the major tensions in the field are largely between critical animal studies and what, for lack of a better word, I'll call descriptive empirical research, in the sense that critical animal studies is prescriptive. And what this has meant in sociology is probably best illustrated with a couple of examples, quick examples. A founding figure in our subfield, the late Clifton Bryant, studied and engaged in legal licensed big game hunting. He went on safari in Africa, and some of his empirical work examined the motivations of hunters, the rewards that they claim to have experienced in the activity, among other things like understanding the demographics of hunters. Now, today, Cliff would have a very hard time presenting a paper on that topic, having it accepted at a panel at our annual sociology conference. And if in fact he did get the paper accepted and presented it, he would face very, very strident criticism for not condemning hunting. And I would argue that we need research of that sort to understand phenomena first, and then those who want to ban it can draw on that research. Second quick example, a former PhD student of mine, now a tenured professor, studied ranchers' relationships with their cattle and how ranching shaped their identities. And he didn't condemn meat eating. In fact, when he interviewed ranchers and they went to lunch together, he ate meat. And not to do so would have made the interviews very challenging, and it would have colored the whole interactions in a way that would have prevented him from getting the rich, fruitful data that he got. Today, similar to the other example, there is a strong faction in the Animals and Society section in sociology that would find this research abhorrent for not taking a stand against animal agriculture. And the third example, also from a meeting of the American Sociological Association several years ago when it was held in Denver, one of the activities that was open for people to participate in society-wide was a visit to a bison ranch outside of Denver. And some of the officers in the Animals and Society section at the time decided to write a letter to the association protesting this, speaking on behalf of the entire section. And when I was on the council at the time, and when they circulated the letter, I said I didn't support it. I said, I think the only way we're going to save the bison in this country is if some people eat them. And we're not going to be able to support bison just as pets or wild herds if we don't have some way to use them. But that position did not land very well at all. And I could give you a whole list of other examples, but I think this divisiveness has a very negative influence on the field. And it makes it increasingly less likely that human animal studies will find a secure home in the university. If the field is seen as totally abolitionist, we're going to lose our foothold. And when I mention this, oftentimes people make comparisons to the study of slavery to justifying its existence. And that's not where I mean to go at all. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I do think this is one of those boulders that Ken mentioned. I also agree with Ken about other boulders like the disciplinary silos that we're in academia, especially in American academia. It makes interdisciplinary research very difficult. The way that grants are funded. And currently, the focus of research funding is in sociology is on two areas, COVID and race. And I think we can tie animals, we can connect animals to both of those topics. And I hope that many of my colleagues are willing to do that. So 6 minutes and 19 seconds. There we go.
Okay, so Jessica. Dr. Jessica Ulrich is professor for art history and aesthetics at the University of Fine Arts, Münster, and lecturer for art education at the University of Arts in Berlin. Her research interests concentrate on the ethics and aesthetics of human-animal relationships in contemporary art. She is the editor of Tierstudien, the first academic journal on animal studies in Germany, and she presented a wonderful paper earlier in this conference. So, Jessica.
Thank you, Ken, for your question, and thank you, Leslie, for your reply. I have a little bit different stance, maybe. I want to mention 4 points. One concerns ontology, another one practices in regard of research language, another one proponents of the field and the question of diversity. So not only only how do we speak and publish, but who gets listened to. And the last point concerns methodology, so namely the role of art. And Ken, you already said something about that, and I totally agree. I think some of the major tensions within the field result from the different perspectives of what human animal studies is by definition and what disciplines should be included in human animal studies in a normative way. For example, are the natural sciences a part of human animal studies or not? So is human animal studies an umbrella term for all scientists and scholars who work on human animal relations? Or do they only include those scholars in the social sciences and the humanities, or maybe post-humanities even, that counterbalance biology's claim as the authority on non-human animals? And there are always normative and ethical questions attached to that definition. For example, how flexible or how rigid are our ethical principles? And I have the impression, just like Leslie actually, that institutionalized human animal studies mirror recent changes in society in general, like for example, the rise of veganism, which is, at least in my country, challenging the vegetarianism as the mainstream animal-friendly diet. And I see a parallel in the more and more defensive stance of animal welfarism in human-animal studies scholarship, compared to the growing importance of more critical approaches, critical animal studies that clearly favor animal rights. And the question would be if universities should aim for pluralism within human animal studies, so balancing welfarist and critical positions, or is it a wiser strategy to adopt a clear standpoint, maybe only for institutional profile, or yeah. And I personally fear, other than Leslie maybe, that we will weaken abolitionist positions or important scholarship on animals as political agents, as relevant subjects in their own right, if human animal studies becomes a neutral umbrella term for all and everything that has to do with human animal interactions in academia. Another potential tension that I see from my own situatedness is that English plays such a major role in the academic discourse. So all the important publications and institutional impulses have been in English and originated in English-speaking countries. So most conferences and publications are English language only, this one not, but it's divided, English and not English. And this, of course, reflects the importance, but also the dominance of English as an academic language, and that applies to all fields, not only human animal studies. And there are, of course, many advantages to a common language in the international community for this worldwide networking and mutual academic understanding. Nevertheless, I think multilingual discourses are very important for the further development of the field too. So the dimensions of diversity amongst the proponents of the field, like including linguistic diversity, but also ethnic and social diversity, must find its equivalent in a diversity of spoken and written languages when it comes to conferences, to books, to articles. I feel there is not enough recognition of important scholarship in other languages, everything that happens outside the English bubble, and findings and perspectives that are not translated into English are just overlooked. And that leads me to another point I would like to make, which is somewhat related. I think human animal studies is still too white, clearly too white, and needs more Black voices, non-white viewpoints, and the field needs more, needs to be decolonized. I mean, that also applies to every other field, I guess, in academia. And I know there are more and more attempts to do so, like Black veganism is a big thing, big discourses on Black veganism or indigenous scholarship, but it's not yet become mainstream human animal studies scholarship, at least not at all in Germany. So the further decolonization of the field is a challenge we have to address, I think. And also, maybe also related, there's definitely a problem when people feel that there is an opposition between human-centered social justice movements and animal-centered justice movements. Ken, you already said that. Leslie also hinted at that. When people get the impression that the battles against racism or sexism or ableism are conflicting with the battles against speciesism or animal oppression. I think human animal studies scholarship should point to the interconnectedness of all these issues more. And the same holds true for the fight against global warming, climate change, which we all know cannot be separated from the fight for animal rights, indigenous rights, and so on. But that means that institutionally, post-colonial studies, gender studies, disability studies, environmental studies, and human animal studies should find their common grounds and forge alliances. At the same time, I think it's important that the specific ethics of human animal studies should always be kept in mind, and we have to pay attention not to reduce animals and their well-being just as a means for an anthropocentric fight against global warming. And if I have time, finally, my last point would be the importance and the potential of the arts sector when it comes to the future development of human animal studies. We have seen that in the conference really nicely with poetry and film and literature and so the contribution of artists and art-based researchers to the field should not be underestimated, and I think that the arts are often marginalized in academic institutions still. It oftentimes seems as if academia still only tolerates approaches of human animal studies that are shaped by the tradition of European Enlightenment and rationalism that has proven to be inherently anthropocentric, of course. And I think artistic methodologies should equally be part of the field, as well as non-Western methodologies. And we have heard that in the talk by Eva Spiegelhofer today, relational methodologies like multispecies ethnography and storytelling, art of attentiveness, and so on. I leave it like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. So Núria Almiron is Associate Professor of Communication at the Universitat Pompeu, Fabra, and the co-director of the UPF Center for Animal Ethics. Her main research topics include and merge the political economy of communication, communication ethics, interest groups, and critical animal and media studies. She's the author and co-editor of several books in different languages, like an Animal, Critical Animal Studies, Approaches to Borders, Displacement, and Othering, co-edited with Natalie Casal, forthcoming book. Núria?
Thanks, Ken. Thank you first for having me here in this panel, and congratulations to the organizer of this wonderful conference. Well, I had prepared some notes, but I think I'm not going to start with them because Leslie was so provocative for me that I need to adapt, to reshape my talk. Very constructively, but Leslie, I cannot disagree more with you. And I don't like to put labels on the work of people, so I feel more connected and more close to critical animal studies than to human animal studies. But for me, it was not a problem at all to be invited in a panel with a title of human animal studies, because I took it as a general label for talking about animal defense, not for talking about our struggles or apparent struggles within the field. But in any case, I don't think, at least I don't see critical animal studies as a struggling subfield within human animal studies. I think it's a totally different thing. Of course, the pioneers in the academia in social sciences and humanities were more close to human animal studies, to this label, but I don't think critical animal studies can be seen as a sub-branch of the field. So I don't see it in such a controversial way as Leslie put it, though for me, the examples she has made about giving priority to your research goal, and if it's needed, eating meat for this, or supporting eating bison, or not condemning hunting because this makes your research more effective, I cannot agree at all with this, and probably this is where I feel less comfortable within the human animal studies label. The human animal studies label for me doesn't need the human at the very beginning. We should be talking about animal studies from social sciences and humanities. This is my field. And well, because of probably my focus on critical animal studies, what I prepared was that for me, the major tension within the animal studies research in general in academia is the same tension we have in society. And it's related to, for me, the capitalistic logics, which are logics that produce within the academia, from my point of view, the same contradictions and the same delays that in the rest of society. These logics means that the more universalized or the more accepted our perspective is, and when I say our perspective, I'm including anyone in animal defense, but it seems that when the more universalized is within this capitalistic logic, the more weakened are the core root values of animal defense because of the trend to commoditize everything, of the trend of capitalism, of turning everything into something which produces a benefit, an economic benefit or a material benefit. And I think we have the same problem within universities, a problem of if we, at this moment, we have an increasing number of scholars in a very large number of different fields in social sciences and humanities, which is very positive. But we don't have the syllabus, the programs, the subjects incorporated into the different degrees. So I think this is one of our major barriers, and something that until we cannot get it formalized, institutionalized, only having this increasing number of researchers in the universities is not enough. And at the same time, I think we are, all of us, critical animal studies, human animal studies, and anyone defending animals, non-human animals from the academia, we must be very, very aware of where we are, because universities nowadays and from the very beginning have become one of the most important stakeholders in particularly horrendous oppression of non-human animals, which is the one related with animal experimentation, with vivisection. So universities are main stakeholders of the vivisection industrial complex. And that means that all our efforts within these institutions will always face with this huge barrier, which is a huge barrier because it's not only a matter of routines and procedures and how tradition has been doing within experimental sciences, it's also a matter of power and budgets, because vivisection, animal experimentation gathers the largest budgets within universities, and that means power, that means prestige for the universities, and that put things more difficult for us to be able to move ahead animal defense within all the different fields in university, because we have within our own organizations our probably biggest enemies. So I would say probably that for me the most productive thing is not to focus on the differences within us as academics, but to focus on what we can share and move together ahead, because we have all these tendencies and trends from outside society within university, starting by this issue of animal experimentation within societies, within society and within universities.
Great.
And I think I have completed my time.
Yes, good. Thank you. Appreciate that point of view. Robert Mitchell is Foundation Professor of Psychology and Animal Studies at Eastern Kentucky University, where he is coordinator for both the Animal Studies program and the General Experimental Psychology Master's program. He created the Animal Studies undergraduate major, the first of its kind at EKU in 2010. His edited books examine deception, pretending, imagination, self-recognition, and spatial cognition in animals and children. Bob.
Hi, and thank you for the invitation and for the wonderful people before me. All of you presented such interesting ideas, and my sense is what I'm going to say is somewhat tangential. So I apologize for that. It was hard for me to answer this question because it felt like there were so many issues that could be brought up. And so I decided to focus on one. And the one that I decided to focus on was interdisciplinarity. And I'm just going to give you some background about myself, but first I want to say that I tended to call the field animal studies, in part because I wanted to be able to say we could focus on animals themselves, whatever that is, without concern about humans. And so what I'll talk about is using the word animal studies. I think, so background on me. My area of interest for most of my career in relation to animals has been on dog-human play and on primate cognition. And you could imagine those two fields probably have a lot of oddness about them. One thing, when I first studied dogs, it was about 40 years ago, people sort of viewed dogs as this weird species that you couldn't really say anything about animals from. So they were a hybrid species. Somehow they were not really animals because they had been domesticated. And then with primate cognition, there were always these issues about being too human interpretive about what they do. And given that my interest was in how similar great apes were to each other as well as to humans, this raised the issue of anthropomorphism, which constantly came up. So in part because of the way that what I was interested in was responded to, and also because I'd had some wonderful philosophy courses on animal mind and animal ethics as an undergraduate, I really became interested in thinking about how we think about animals. So I was sort of engaged by the idea of, you know, what kind of conceptual issues come about when we talk about animals, what kind of philosophical issues. And I also really enjoyed reading a lot about animals in literature and in other areas. The consequence of this is that it kind of forced me to find a way to look into what I was interested in, which was really animal studies, as the field is viewed. And so the result of that was that I helped to create a animal studies major at my university, and it was the first animal studies major that I know of. And in doing that, what I wanted to do was give students an awareness of the different ways that different groups approach animals. And so the major was inherently interdisciplinary. Students learn about science, they learn about the arts and humanities, and they learn about applied fields. So in science, they would learn about biology from biologists, ecology, animal behavior, zoology. They learn about biological anthropology from an anthropologist, comparative psychology from a psychologist. In arts and humanities, they would learn about history, unfortunately from me, not from a historian, because we couldn't get any historian who was interested in talking about animals in history, but a cultural anthropology, literature, ethics, and sociology. A lot of people wouldn't view that as a humanities, but somehow we did. And then also by applied fields like conservation, law, and agriculture. And the development of it occurred when I put out a notice, would any faculty be interested in developing an animal studies major at EKU? And everyone came from all these different disciplines. They were all interested. And I'd say the only ones who had a vested interest were the biologists and the agriculture people, because they were concerned that this was going to be a necessarily activist degree. And one of the things I wanted to do was to get students to actually learn about what they do in biology and in agriculture. And just to tell you, one of the surprises for me is that none of the students have done anything in relation to the way the agricultural animals are treated. It always surprised me. My university, even though I've done things to try to stop them, still engage in castration without anesthesia of the pigs, and the students do this. They can engage, they're not required to, but they can engage in this, and none of the students have done anything against this, which totally surprised me because I thought they would be doing a lot against that. Anyway, the thing about this is it gives students an interdisciplinary exposure. They get to see how biologists approach animals, how ag people approach animals, how literature people do, psychologists, etc. And my idea was kind of that if in doing that, it was kind of like giving them an undergraduate education. They learn about different perspectives from different people, right? And so they would get to be able to think about animals in a diversity of ways. So I view interdisciplinarity as not a boulder, but actually something extremely positive. I think it's something that we can all learn from. However, I just had a meeting with some anthrozoologists about developing the field and developing coordinations with each other. And one of the things that surprised me was almost all of them said that they experienced marginalization and loneliness in studying animal studies. And I don't know about you, but I haven't experienced that. And I think part of it's because we have a major that is supported by the university. And so I think the rest of the people seem to teach a course or have a concentration or do something where they're not really supported by the university in any kind of big way. And so I really do think that developing a major that is interdisciplinary is beneficial to the field. I also think that those who teach in animal studies have to develop a kind of openness to diverse disciplines. I think we have to be willing to read about things we don't want to read about, perhaps, and also we have to be willing to read outside of our field of expertise. So, for example, I have not been trained as a literature person, but in my intro class, I do read literature with students and discuss it. And so I think we have to not only support interdisciplinary, but also we want to thrive on it. I think we really want to engage in that, not only for ourselves, but also in others. My colleague who came into animal studies de novo, she'd never really heard about it before coming to EKU. It took her a while to understand, to look at things from an interdisciplinary point of view. When you're trained in comparative psychology, a lot of times you don't end up developing that.
Please wrap it up.
Okay, so the wrap up is that I want to support the idea of interdisciplinarity. I think it's a positive vector for animal studies rather than one that's problematic.
Great, thank you. So we now could take some questions. Anat, if you could help me here, we go through chat or we go through raised hands.
Sure. You can either use the chat box or raise your hand for questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat yet.
Yeah, not yet.
Any raised hands?
Not that I see, but maybe if it's okay, I can ask one question.
Please.
And it's about critical animal studies and animal studies in general. I'm wondering whether to have critical animal studies as an opening point in any university would maybe even sabotage our chances to build this field within the university. And I wonder how can we combine perspectives of critical animal studies inside universities, like Núria said, that conduct experiments on non-human animals. And this is something I was thinking along the way, because many times if you want to engage in interdisciplinary studies, we have to work with zoologists or people who conduct themselves experiments on animals. And we all have our limits on what to include as animal experiments. So this is kind of a question I was wondering about.
Anybody want to respond to that?
So the question is how to combine critical animal studies and human animal studies, or how to combine animal studies in general with animal experimentation?
I was thinking more about when can define the field as interdisciplinary. then one question is, how can we work with the, for example, other researchers from other disciplines that conduct research on animals, and indeed also have a critical animal studies standpoint. And the other is, even if we could even call ourselves critical animal studies if we work in universities that conduct experiments, and every university does that. So,
well, that question could work also for society. If we can call critical animal scholars ourselves, if we are in this society, this species society. I don't know. I don't think labels are ideal help to understand ourselves, but I don't think they are ideal. In any case, what to do with researchers that work with non-human animals in violent ways? Well, for me, I prefer not to collaborate with them. That's simply that. That doesn't mean that I don't try to talk with them, to have a conversation, but in general, is not the critical animal studies scholar the one not having the conversation, but the other side. In general, the ones experimenting with non-human animals, for some reason, they don't feel very comfortable with us. So probably it's because they know that there is some problem with what they do. But I think we can always engage into conversations. But one thing is to engage into conversations, to have dialogues, to try to, for us to convince them to go for alternatives. And another thing is to work with them. There is no need to work with people doing harm on non-human animals. No need for me.
thank you. And we have Daphne. You can unmute yourself, I think. Daphne is raising her.
Hi, thank you all very much. This is really very interesting. If I can return to a label, we were talking about animal research or animal studies, and it seems to be an incredibly broad topic that would probably include almost, well, not almost all, but a lot of disciplines. And I was thinking maybe talking about multi-species studies would be somewhat more of a confining definition that would be more accurate. What would you think about talking about multi-species studies?
Myself again? Or
This is for everyone.
I can answer, but I don't want to just capitalize the time. So
I'm raising my hand as well, but I don't want to say anything to the labeling, even though I agree with Bob. I usually also say just animal studies, and I think that's very inclusive. And I tell my students to use that term, but university tells me I have to use human animal studies. So the courses are labeled human animal studies, but I always call them animal studies myself. But I would just wanted to agree with Núria that in my experience, universities are very diverse institutions, and conflicts within universities are normal. And we shouldn't be too cautious to, about taking a critical stance within the institution. Like gender studies or post-colonial studies have shown that that a clear and sometimes radical standpoint can be established, and that we need that to make our point. So I would, just like Núria, I wouldn't want to work with people who do animal experimentation. We have to talk with them and try to convince them that this is not the right thing to do. But yeah, just wanted to agree with Núria, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. I just didn't notice you raised your hand. I'm sorry.
Okay. We should move on to the second round.
Oh,
So if you want to put up the question for the second round.
sure.
Ken, there are a couple of raised hands, actually. I think Margot and other people are raising their hands. So,
Okay,
Eva.
well, we can go to
Do we
them.
have time?
Well, let's do it. Sure, sure.
Okay, so Eva and then Margot.
First, another technical thing about no questions in the chat. I noticed that the chat is deactivated, maybe for everyone who is not co-host. So that would explain why there are no questions. Or it's just for me, I don't know. And then I have just a quick and very specific question for Robert, who described this interdisciplinary major, how this works financially at your university, because from what I have noticed so far, is that it can be quite rigid and difficult to establish an interdisciplinary program because financing is compartmentalized at the universities. So how did you deal with that problem?
So generally the way that it's dealt with is that we use people in other departments who are already there. So biologists teach the biology courses, anthropologists teach the anthropology courses. And so we use who is available. When there isn't anyone available, typically that means that I have to teach a course in something I have to teach myself about. So financially, it's been fine, and we've only been able to afford one new faculty member, but it doesn't seem to be a problem in that way.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
Bob, isn't it also that you are housed in psychology, so the existing infrastructure kind of administratively was already there?
Yeah, we're housed in psychology, but again, we're not a psychology degree, it's an animal studies degree. And the students are not required to take psychology courses except for comparative psych. So we have support for that, but mostly we actually end up benefiting the psych department because they get the benefit of all the courses we teach and all the points we get for teaching them. So I wondered, has anybody talked to Daphne's question? Because I thought it was an interesting question. It seems like you want to talk about human-animal interaction or something like that. Is that right? And it seems as though a lot of what we're talking about, even in the case of experimentation, we're talking about human-animal interaction. But I think you may have meant something different. So what did you mean?
Well, what I meant was that multi-species relations are not about a specific species necessarily, but rather about interactions, but not necessarily just human-animal interactions, but also different species within non-human animal worlds. And I think if we talk about multi-species studies, then that encapsulates a certain aspect of what we're doing, which is cross-species interactions. And yeah.
I totally agree. And I think it is fascinating to look at human animal as well as other, bear human, bear dog, bear whatever. I mean, I think even those are really interesting. So I agree with you. That is a worthwhile, and that may be where the field will end up going. It will just become animal studies where we're not concerned with the human aspect. In the course that I teach, I try to have students be aware of animal interactions that don't involve humans, but most of it is focused on the social psychological literature on the human. So
If we don't focus on the human part of it, how are we going to use this academic field to undercut the various practices that oppress animals? Since the humans are the ones who are doing the discrimination and oppression. So if you do a bear-dog study, unless it has some implications for human-animal relations, I'm dubious about including it in what I call animal studies or human-animal studies.
But I think there is, I agree with the multi-species label and also the interspecies. I think it's a very interesting way of putting it. But the animal studies or the critical animal studies put the focus on the animals, which means to put the focus on the ones who are the worst off. And I think that's interesting. And regarding the human interrelation and the ones who are oppressing and leaving them out from the label, I think it's important to remember that non-human animals regardless the many ways that they are oppressed by humans, they also need our support and help when they live in nature, because in nature they can go through a lot of suffering without our intervention. Now with our anthropogenic climate change intervention, of course, that's increased, but without our intervention, we can also find many different examples of how to help and assist non-human animals in nature. So I think the human always in some way is putting a focus on us that we don't need it for addressing the human oppression and also the suffering of non-humans in nature.
Okay, I'm gonna come in here and move to this. I want us to move to the second question. What is the most effective role of the field in informing, influencing the politics and practices governing our current treatment of animals? What is its relationship to the animal protection movement? So we start with Bob.
Lucky me, given that this was what I found more difficult to talk about. Anyway, bear with me, everyone. So one of the things that I thought about was how other groups engage in influencing politics and practices. And for example, biology, you might think that they've been ignoring of animal protection, but within biology, in conservation, people in conservation have become aware that if they don't become activists, there's nothing left for them to conserve. There's nothing there anymore. So within conservation, people have become activists within their field, and this is now accepted in a way that I think it wasn't 20 years ago even. And maybe it's because of the rapid increase in extinction. Within psychology, you have activism toward bettering the lives of humans. And I think in some ways it came slowly within psychology, but eventually now we have, you'd be surprised if a clinical psychologist did not publicly support those with mental health issues, or if you had social psychologists who did not publicly express positions against prejudice and discrimination. So it seems to me that given that those can be viewed positively, it seems as though the activism within animal studies can be also viewed positively. Minimally, I think the activism that we do see is generally about animal welfare, but there are also activism toward getting rid of labs, zoos, and agricultural animals as treated the way that they're treated. And so in the case of the best way to get this forward, it seems to me that as an educator, educating students is certainly one way to increase the political and policy agendas. Making students aware of how animals have been oppressed, making them aware of what has been done and what has and hasn't worked within a class in which you talk about humans and animals in interaction, seems to me to give them a way to think, how am I going to react to this? How am I going to deal with this? What am I going to do? Sometimes students simply just don't want to deal with it, and you can't really pressure them to, but I think that making them aware that they can have a positive influence by even minimally decreasing the amount of meat they eat is a very positive thing to do. Not the only thing to do, but a very positive thing to do. On the other hand, I also think that within the university, as Núria was pointing out, there does seem to be a kind of vested interest in doing certain kinds of activities with animals. And I remember my experience on the Animal Care Committee, the Animal Care and Use Committee, in which we are required to see if there are any legal issues that we have to work with in what people do to animals, and also welfare issues. And it was very frustrating for the chair of the committee, because I would say, I have some issues, and he would say, of course you do. And, of course, Bob, you're going to say something. And this was very frustrating to me, because one of the things you're supposed to do in this committee is act respectfully toward all points of view. And it was clear that the point of view that was concerned with animal welfare was not one that was going to be viewed respectfully within this committee. Needless to say, it didn't stop me. Outside of the field of animal studies, it seems like one of the most obvious things to do is legislation, But in teaching the law course that I teach about legislation in relation to animals, I was completely surprised that having a law on the books did not mean that it was going to be followed. So typically without money to support something like the Endangered Species Act, or if that's in the US, or the Wild Horses and Burros Act, if there's no money going into that, then they're basically gutted. And so legislation is, I think, problematic as a way to make change. Again, I don't think we shouldn't try to get laws on the books, and certainly that's something you want to do, but it's also very hard because in America anyway, so many of the legislators are focused on one thing. For example, they're anti-abortion, and that's all they care about. And so the Humane Society goes to them and tries to get them to work on laws against oppression in animals, and they say, well, you know, why should I care about this?
Can you wrap up, Bob?
Sure. Just one more thing to suggest is that popular journals and popular books are another way to get the message across. And you see people like Jonathan Balcom and, you know, Ken working on books that are going to get that across. So those are ways that I would suggest.
Okay, Núria, we're a little bit behind in time, so if you could.
Okay. Well, as a communication scholar, I always remind to my students that there is not a single right strategy for being effective, for having an impact on our publics, regarding the question, which is the effective role of the field in informing the politics. So I always remind them that it makes no sense to give preference to logics or to ethics or to emotions when communicating to our publics, because we need all, because social marketing, social psychology, public relations, and advocacy research show once and again that we cannot convince only with raw data, with facts, though facts, of course, help a lot to sustain our arguments. Likewise, all this research shows that emotions can only very rarely be left out of influence campaigns, though we need to dose emotions with wisdom, of course. And equally, research shows that ethics usually have the most long-lasting impacts, though it is difficult to achieve results only with cold ethics. Emotions need to be involved, and facts help to ground the final pack. So there is not a single way of influencing. It depends on the publics, on the moment, and in general, on the wisest combination of these three key argumentative appeals. However, that said, if I had to say what is missing the most, I would say ethics. I think we need to make a stronger use of animal ethics for convincing regulators. Animal ethics is nowadays still a very rare subject in universities, even in philosophy degrees. And this is very problematic. It means that we are not providing the next generation of thinkers with a basic tool. And likewise, we are living out of social movements history, or of social communication, or of political sciences, a topic which is essential, of course, for making animal defense a mainstream paradigm at some point. So I think it is a must to move the topic within the academics much more in order to be able to make an impact on society and regulators. And concerning the second part of the question, which is very interesting regarding our relationship with the animal defense movement, well, first, I would say that I think we are also part of the animal defense movement. As a critical animal studies scholar, as a critical political economy scholar, as a critical media scholar, I do not pursue neutrality. I am an academic advocate which attempts to do her work with objectivity, but not with neutrality. And objectivity and neutrality are terms that sometimes are used as synonymous, but they are not synonymous. Objectivity is not a realistic goal. We are subjects, but we can at least try to do our job as researchers in a way which is rigorous and honest and not influenced by prejudices. However, neutrality is another very different thing. One can be neutral in front of an ice cream choice, but we cannot be neutral in face of suffering and pain, violence, oppression, etc. We know this very well for all the social justice causes, and we should apply this also for animal defense. And well, that said, my view is that within the academia, one of the things that we can do the best for the animal defense movement in general is to provide them with the research, the data, the knowledge, and also the expert voice, because the academia still has some prestige that the movement needs. And for instance, when we created the UPF Center for Animal Ethics, we had mostly that in mind, to be a source for animal advocates. And I do not think it is of any benefit that we enter the struggle of who is more effective in the movement, or who is more liberationist or more welfarist, or who is more whatever. I see myself and my colleagues at the university as public servants for anyone advocating for non-human animals and interspecies social justice. So I think we should be a tool for them to use our voice, research, and work in general.
Very good. Thank you. We're a little bit behind. Jessica.
Okay, just stop me if I'm talking too much. I think the field should seek alliances with neighboring areas like post-colonial studies, gender studies, environmental studies, and so on. And because I think that if the domain of politics mistakes human-animal studies as a single issue area, we do not reach our full potential of informing and influencing lawmakers or politics. And I think this does not mean, and it should not mean, that the field has to compromise its stance on animal ethics and animal-friendly politics. So animals should not be reduced to a means of just designing better futures for humankind. But it's necessary to acknowledge that human rights and animal rights are not conflicting, but that they further and complement each other. So has been said before, but solidarity with other justice, social justice movements, especially by established academics, professors, is a key signal to politics that these processes cannot be seen as opposing or even as unrelated to each other. So we must address the violence of dualisms, binary thinking everywhere in cases of sexism, racism, speciesism, and so on. And I think that we also have to join forces with many diverse people inside and outside of human animal studies, and also with NGOs. Like we have to look for direct cooperation of animal advocacy NGOs with academic scholars of human animal studies. That's pretty rare, at least in Germany. And I think that the human animal studies expertise could and should inform NGOs that work on a more hands-on basis for the improvement of human animal relations. And we have to work with activists too. So I agree totally with Núria that we cannot be neutral. We must take a stand. So no professor, she said that, for gender studies or no lecturer for post-colonial studies would be expected to remain neutral in her own field of expertise. So why should this be the case for human animal studies scholars? It can be problematic for academic careers to be identified with animal advocacy, especially in an early stage of career. But still, I think we should always take the side of the animals, facing the industrial animal complex, the detrimental consequences of meat consumption, and the destructive relations between animal exploitation and climate change. We have obviously good reason to do so. Concerning your question to the relationship to the animal protection movement, for me, the very term animal protection movement conveys like an association with welfarist positions. And I think we have to lead a critical dialogue with animal welfare groups, protection groups, but I find it more interesting to ask about the relationship to animal rights movements or animal liberation. And I think today we should be closer to abolitionist and right-based approaches than to classical welfare positions, which are widely accepted in theory and I know very seldomly enforced in practice, but we already have very good laws for animal protection, even though they're not enforced. But at the same time, rights-based approaches and political theories are still pretty controversial and not taken seriously in public debates. So we should be critically pushing the boundaries of public debates and not just affirming positions that have already been incorporated in legislation or that are common sense and public opinion. And maybe just like one little point again, I want to come back to the arts. As I've said earlier, sometimes the arts are marginalized in inner institutional processes, but they can make a very huge impact when it comes to changing public opinion towards animals, and in consequence, maybe also to the treatment of animals. So one prime example would be has been mentioned, I think, the album Songs of the Humpback Whales by Roger Payne. I mean, there has been a lot of scientific research on the whale songs, but I think 1970, this album by Roger Payne was the recordings of whale song was framed and marketed as a commercial music production, and it reached mass audiences. Was one of the best-selling albums of Western popular music history. And I think the abolishment of commercial whaling would probably not have been taken place without this publication of whale song. So it initiated like a conscious, change of awareness about the consciousness beyond the human. And I just leave it like that for time reasons.
Great, thank you. Leslie?
In terms of the most effective role of the field in politics and practices, my answer is education, education, and education. Most of us won't have very much influence in politics. Some will, but we can influence students who will have such influence. I just last semester had 142 students in my Animals and Society class. That's 142 opportunities for people to tell more people, to tell more people. And in terms of the relationship of the field to the animal protection movement, I think one of the best things we can do was mentioned by Bob, and that's we have to do more to reach relevant constituencies and stakeholders through publications, presentations, interviews with the press. I've had a modest amount of success with this from my work on animal welfare and disasters, and on homeless people and their pets. And some universities are beginning to recognize what they call outreach work that responds to the needs of given communities. And I think we can all find ways to engage in that kind of outreach. And I'm going to yield the rest of my time because I really would like more questions.
Okay.
So I saw Yara. Yara, you wanted to ask something?
I'm being without a video, but really related to the last discussion. And actually I'm dealing, as an early career, I'm dealing with the dilemma in that subject. I am investigating the relationship between human beings and birds in urban areas. And it's really hard, both in academic and outside, because I do wish to connect both sides and to be an advocate for coexistence for various reasons. But I wanted to know what is your recommendations, how to proceed as an early career.
Could you repeat the area you're studying? I didn't catch it.
Wild boar and human relationships in urban area. It's a massive problem in Haifa, Israel. I will also study 2 more cities in the world, and in research for also a solution. I never did it before. I come from dog-human relations, so I moved to another species, and I have a lot to learn. But this is a new problematic of it being a wild animal, but not as it used to be, because we know there are also genetic changes, and the animal itself changes because of its proximity to urban places.
There's a lot of work on human-wildlife conflict that would probably be relevant. And also, I think, I'm not sure where you want to go with this, but Knight has something that he did with the Japanese, looking at their attitudes toward different animals that they interact with. And in his studies, one of the things that was remarkable was the ambivalence that people had. You know, you'd think that they would be angry with the boars, for eating their crops, but they actually had some ambivalence toward them because they felt that they were hungry and they needed to eat something. And so how could they work to not just get rid of them, but work with them, which I thought was really interesting. Margot about that.
I think that one of the main problem I'm dealing with it is that I want to advocate for coexistence, and I think there are ways to do that, but the city I'm currently research is torn apart for two different groups, one who really love the boars and the boars' existence in the urban space, and the other who hates. So, and the municipality and other institutions are in the middle. So it's a really dynamic and power relation for a field of research.
Thank you, Yara. Margot?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment because it feels like this question about how much advocacy we can do in the classroom just kind of keeps coming up over and over. And I am now living in the most conservative place I've ever lived in my life, with the most conservative students I've ever met in my life. And for me, what that means is my values haven't changed, but how I talk about them and how I talk to the students absolutely has. So, I mean, we all know this, that there's no kind of one size fits all approach to the issue. But for me, I mean, we don't go into teaching so that we can get our students to stop eating meat, but for a lot of us, that is kind of a win when that happens. Well, the wins now that I would celebrate are very different from what I would have thought about 2 years ago. So, it's, I co-taught a class on animal welfare science with a veterinarian who's a livestock veterinarian who works in and with the very industries that I kind of critique. And that was a challenging class, but also a super rich class because she's talking about whatever body conformation and I'm talking about capitalism. And I feel like the students kind of got a lot out of that mixed approach. But again, the type of advocacy that maybe I might have done a couple of years ago is not really even a possibility where I'm at now. So just kind of throwing that out.
Same in Kentucky.
Sure.
Thank you. Michal?
Yes, thank you, everyone. It was really, really interesting panel. I have a question for you, Núria. So you criticize the capitalist system, which on one hand, I agree with you, because that's the system that creates the animal agriculture. But on the other hand, I want to ask you, don't you think that this is precisely the capitalist system that has empowered technology that leads to the plant-based food substitutes innovation? And I think that if not these substitutes, which I see a strong connection between them, technology and the logic of the capitalism, then what is the realistic solution for the modern animal agriculture?
Thank you, Michael. Well, I could have criticized capitalism, but I actually did not in what I said. I just did that. I just said that we are tensioned by the problems of the capitalistic logic, which could have meant that we can somehow fix those problems. I'm not sure. I don't think we can fix capitalism, but in any case, I was not making a proper criticism. That would take longer. I don't think capitalism is the one to blame for all. It's just the system that has been more effective in massively oppressing non-human animals, but before capitalism, oppression already exists. And as Kenneth mentioned in his introduction, socialism and communism haven't shown to be a lot better. In the opposite, probably. So I think first what we have to do is to try to look at whether we can amend what we have, and then try to go for solutions to this and maybe fix everything. I don't know. And the issue is that we don't even have capitalism. I mean, if you look at what capitalism is, it's not what we have. We have monopolies, oligopolies controlling everything, and that it's not the definition of capitalism, which is free markets and competition. So when we criticize capitalism, I always tend first to say, okay, what we are talking about, what we have now or what capitalism is really. In both cases, I think we can find something better, but I don't know what's the solution, of course. And I'm not saying that socialism or communism is better. I'm not saying that. But of course, we have to address, like liberal democracy. I think liberal democracy is probably the best type of democracy we have been able to figure out, but it's plenty of problems. Patriarchy and sexism are at the roots of it, and speciesism also. So that doesn't mean that we should not fix liberal democracy as well. Sorry for not being more.
Ken, I'm wondering how you view the field as being related to this issue.
The issue of
the question that you're asking about how we can help avoid animal oppression, et cetera.
Well, I mean, to me, historically, the field began with people being very cautious about and unwilling to take advocacy positions. And I think the establishment of the field has given us the license to do that. So, I mean, I encourage all forms of the use of the academics platform, whether it's just education or whether it's developing recommendations about policy and practice, or whether it's more foundational explorations that I see critical animal studies involved with against a capitalist system. So for me, the scholar advocate role is one that we need to develop, and we've been trying to push that more in animals, developing a political animals section of the journal. So my general sense is that, as has been pointed out, anybody who's in a field that has any relationship to a social justice movement, whether it's a child psychologist or environmentalist, is generally accepted as an advocate, and we should not be wary about doing that. The resistance to that has come mostly in the natural sciences area because of their reliance on a commitment to objectivity, which they see as somehow value-free, which of course it isn't. But I think, the natural sciences need to be part of this field. The reason we have emphasized human-animal relationships rather than simply studying animals per se is because there already were fields studying animals per se, and they weren't dealing with the ethical issues and the oppression issues. So that human-animal studies is a device to bring attention to the ways in which humans oppress and discriminate against animals. Certainly it helps to understand the sophistication of whales and other animals and dogs and so forth as an argument for why we shouldn't oppress them. So that that's the center of what you're calling animal studies. And I have no problem with that. Again, to me, human-animal relationships was just a device to draw attention to the oppression and discrimination. But I feel that now some of the natural science folks, the veterinary medicine folks, some of the animal welfare scientists are addressing alternatives to oppression. By the way, animal welfare science is not necessarily animal welfarist. Any study that shows that a particular way of dealing with animals is not consistent with their well-being can be published in Animal Welfare Science, and it may be a replacement or abolitionist position. So animal welfare science is a much more generic field and can contribute to critical animal studies as well as to human animal studies.
Okay, just on time.
I hate to get
thank you.
Somebody else should say something. Anyway,
I would like to.
I want to thank the panelists. I purposely tried to people the panel with differing points of view, and I'm glad that those came out and that there was some discussion. There's certainly a lot more to say. I'm still not clear about what the alternative to some kind of hybrid capitalist system would be. I just don't know what that is. I've been reading a little bit about modern monetary theory, which seems to me to be a replacement to neoliberalism, but I don't know much about it. Anyway, thanks again to the panel, and thank you to Anat for inviting us and allowing us to have this panel. And again, congratulations on a wonderful conference.
Thank you so much, Ken. And I would like to thank all the participants of this enlightening panel.